Interview with General Sir Nick Carter, who's the former Chief of Defence Staff of the United Kingdom. He spoke to my colleague Shivani Gupta. He reflects on some of these past wars and draws comparisons with what is unfolding right now in this axis involving America, Israel and Iran, this conflict that involves these three powers. He shares his perspective on what may be driving President Trump and how this is likely to proceed over the next few days.
What we're witnessing year after year are, wars, are conflicts, some of, old making, but they're now descending into actual armed military conflicts. How do you look at this latest step by US and Israel?
Yes, I think before we go into that, I think it's just worth reflecting on that last observation you made about there being so much war now and reflecting perhaps on why that is the case. Because, of course, I was a child of the Cold War, where we were in a bipolar world that was inherently stable. And we then left that bipolar world at the end of the Cold War, and we had a US that wanted to be the global policeman, exercised her muscles doing that. And actually, we had the end of history. You'll remember Francis Fukuyama writing that. And, of course, there was inherent stability. And that all started to go wrong come 9/11. When, of course, we had the slightly weirdly named global war on terror. And during the course of that, we've ended up, as we've exited from it, with a multipolar world which doesn't have any inherent rules to it. It seems to be that might now is suddenly right. And I think it's worth reflecting on that before one dives into what is occurring today, which, of course, your listeners will be fascinated by. Because what's that all about? What are the objectives? What are people trying to achieve here? Because there's also a direct correlation between setting out achievable objectives and whether you achieve victory.
So how do you read into this then? Why are we seeing so many conflicts? And you talked about America's role post-Cold War, but we're seeing a very different America today under Donald Trump. Nobody seems to be able to read his mind, and even domestically, he doesn't have much support as far as another, military strike against another country is concerned. None of what America has attempted in the 21st century has actually gone very well as far as the war in Afghanistan is concerned. So how do you read into his mind, and what is he trying to achieve?
Well, I mean, I think you make the point. I think it's very difficult to read his mind, but I think there are some commonalities in his approach, but also some contradictions. I mean, I think we are all, as human beings, victims of our lived experience. And in many ways, when you look at his foreign policy, it's a transactional foreign policy. And we've seen that with the unpredictability of tariffs and the bilateral deals he makes with different countries. He's definitely not a multilateralist, but he's probably a multi-bilateralist, and it's all underpinned by the art of the deal. And we read his book on that, didn't we? So I think there are some themes there that we can perhaps remember and think about as we answer the question. I think the other thing that's been very interesting about this is, and it probably comes to the MAGA connection in his politics, which is this idea of a Western Hemisphere strategy, what he's calling the Dunroe Doctrine, which is taken from the Monroe Doctrine of the 19th century, which is essentially about America first. It's about America dominating the Americas and the Western Hemisphere. And that, of course, then makes one wonder about some of the adventures that are happening beyond there. And I think we all know that the next decade is going to be dominated by an intense competition between the United States and China. It's going to be dominated by a competition for technology, but it's also going to be dominated by a race for influence. And the world that I think is evolving, which comes from that Western Hemisphere, which is the world I think Donald Trump is very comfortable with, is a world of spheres of influence. And that I think is interesting, sitting here in India as a British person, because I think, where middle powers, which we are sort of, sit in the world these days between these spheres of influence, and how we perhaps run with a hare and hunt with the hounds, to use that old British expression, I think is a very interesting question for us to reflect on. But where does this all end? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think, to your point about Afghanistan, if you look back at Western, in parenthesis, interventions since 1945, there's really only been two successful ones. One was when the West came together to evict Saddam Hussein from Kuwait in 1990, and the other perhaps was when the UK decided to take the Falklands back from the Argentinians. Everything else has ended sadly in defeat. And the reason it ends in defeat is because the military objectives don't necessarily fall out of the political objectives. And that, I think, is worth reflecting on when one considers what has been launched today, is how achievable those political objectives are.